My top 10. G'day to all you lovely people. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Kathy, and today I'm going to give you a list of my top 10 favorite fantasy series. In fact, there are more than 10 because this list is very fluid. It changes all the time, depending upon what I'm in the mood for. I also have a few honourable mentions because I couldn't limit myself to 10. If you had asked me last year what my top 10 was, it would be different to what it is today. And I think the same could be said in the next year. I don't know. I may discover some wonderful fantasy series that will make this list. But I have to say, trying to rank these series was really hard as well, because that too is fluid. That too can change. Sometimes I'll remember something from a series and think, oh, it should have been higher up on this list. I know my top 2, my top 3, but the rest, they could be anywhere on this list. I honestly think if you ask me tomorrow, my rankings could be completely different, but we're going to go with what I've got today anyway. I also should mention that most of these fantasy series are older fantasy series, dating back to the 90s. Some you may know, some you may not. I'd love to hear what you think of this list when you hear it anyway. So let's get started because I have quite a few things to get through. I'm going to start with the honourable mentions, which haven't quite made the list today, though might tomorrow. Okay, the first is this, the Dark Elf trilogy by R.A. Salvatore. Drizzt is a really memorable character. He was actually introduced in another trilogy that this author wrote. He was meant to be a minor character, and he proved so popular and I think grew into his own in this series that the author made an entire trilogy based on this character, and in fact has written quite a few books based on Drizzt. It has been many years since I have read this series, though I remember how much I loved it. It would probably have ranked higher if I had reread it recently, but my recollection of it is a bit vague. Regardless, it is about a species of elves, the Dark Elves, who are not very pleasant. But Drizzt, the main character, has much more honour than any of the others of his kin, which makes it for a difficult life for him. I think he's actually exiled at some point. Highly recommend this series. The next honourable mention is The Elenium by David Eddings. I love Sparhawk, who is the main character. This series is about a knight, Sparhawk, the Queen's knight, who is looking for a way to release his queen from a spell that she is under. And his character is one of the most heroic. I consider him a true hero, and he's very funny as well. It's a light read. It's a very enjoyable, very entertaining read, though the women really do annoy me in this series. But Sparhawk, he is well worth it, as is the character Martel, who is an ambivalent character, I think. Definitely worth reading if you haven't tried David Eddings. In my opinion, this is the best of all his fantasy series. And the last honourable mention is this. The Curse of the Mist Wraith is the first book in the Wars of Light and Shadow by Jenny Warts. This is about two half-brothers who step through a gate accidentally into a new world which is shrouded in mist. One wields shadow and one wields light. This is an epic fantasy. I think there are 12, if not more, books. And whilst I really love the story and many of the characters, I do find the author's writing difficult to get through. There are times that I simply can't bear to read her books because they're just too convolutedly written. Definitely worth trying. Perhaps you will like her writing more than I do. Now I'm going to go through my 10 favourite series, but in fact I have 11 here. The problem is that I have 2 here because I couldn't decide, so they're going to be equal 10th. Okay, the first is The Devery Cycle by Catherine Kerr. This is high fantasy involving elves. There are dwarves as well. It involves a very complex magical system, and it also involves reincarnation, which is something unique in the fantasy era, especially when this was published, which was back in the, I think, 80s or 90s. The Devery Cycle is split into acts, and I just reread the first act, and I will definitely be rereading the rest at some point. It is a very well-written series. Catherine Kerr is an excellent writer. Her characters sometimes can be a little bit annoying, because they do annoy me, but I really love this whole world she has created, which is highly influenced by Celtic mythology. Definitely worth trying if you haven't. And the second equal 10th is Red Rising Trilogy by Pierce Brown. I just read this recently and I loved it so much I had to include it on this list. This is in part science fiction in that it takes place on Mars, but really it's dystopian. It is about a group, the Reds, who are being oppressed by the Golds. In fact, the Golds oppress every other colour. They are the ruling class. And what I loved about it is that it relates to our own world. This whole battle between the different classes or different colours, as Pierce Brown has set them up in this world. And the name Red Rising is about the Reds rising to change the status quo. It is about a revolution, I guess. And the characters are so memorable. I love Severo. He is definitely one of my favourite characters, as is Darrow, the main protagonist. I've actually just brought out a video about this book, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But if you like dystopian, if you like a series of books that is relatable to our own world, to class distinctions, because that's basically what it is, then you might love Red Rising. I certainly did. Number 9 is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Game of Thrones is the first book in the series. Now, this series would have ranked higher if Martin had finished it, and he hasn't. And I don't know how many years has passed since he published the last book in this series. He has published other books, but he has not finished this series, which for me is extremely frustrating. I have been reading this since it first came out, which was 96. So I have been waiting 26 years for this series to be finished, and it hasn't been. Do I need to really tell people what this series is about? It is more darker than traditional fantasy, especially back in the 90s. This was quite unusual to have major characters die. You just never saw that in fantasy. It is much darker in tone, much more grim. I know that is a very popular subgenre, I guess, today, but back then it was new. And I remember finishing this first book and just being shocked, not believing it. I thought, no, this can't have happened. But that's all I want to say. I'm sure most people are familiar with the series due to the television show. But I can't rank it high because it's not complete. I don't consider the way the TV series ended complete. That's not the author's vision. I want to see his vision, if we ever do. Number 8 is a series I only read recently, and that is this. the Witcher series. I loved this series so much, but I will confess it was a slow burn for me. It took me a while to warm up to the characters, to this world, but it is such a well-drawn world, and Sapkowski has so many very pointed comments to make about society, not just theirs, but ours. It's a complex storyline. It's a complex world. I loved how real it seemed. And I loved the Witcher, Geralt. Yeah, I just adore him. I loved this series so much that I've done a video on this one as well, which you're welcome to watch. I will list all of these videos that I've done in my description box below if you're interested. But I highly recommend the Witcher series. In fact, this could probably be even higher on the list, but it's hard to decide sometimes. Number 7 is The Deathgate Cycle by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. I have reviewed this series recently as well because I reread it after 10 or 20 years. This series involves 4 different worlds that make up the elements: earth, air, fire, and water. There is an epic, I guess, battle between 2 very powerful species, whilst humans, dwarves, and elves try to make the best of their worlds. One of the reasons I loved this series was it was unique to have 4 different worlds, and actually more than 4, that we view throughout this entire series. And I loved the character Haplo so much. He has one of the best developments in a series. I think so anyway. And of course Alfred. Alfred is just too charming for words. If you're interested in learning more, you can watch the video that I've done on this series. Number 6, Harry Potter. Yeah, he had to make this list. I love these books so much. I know I'm a big kid at heart. What can I say? I actually resisted reading this first one for several years. And then a friend of mine said I had to try it. So I bought it and I read it in an afternoon. I could not put it down. I love this series. It is so entertaining, so charming. The character Harry is just every person's dream, every child's fantasy. Who doesn't want to be a wizard? I want to be a wizard. So it was like your fantasy come to life, and it develops so well. The characters are so memorable, like Hermione and Dumbledore. Who doesn't love Dumbledore? Seriously, this is a favorite that I think everyone should read, not just children. I have read it many, many times, and it's been several years, so I might be rereading it soon in the future. But there was no doubt it was going to make this list. Number 5 is The Axis Trilogy by Sarah Douglas, an Australian author. I think in the States this book is called something else. In fact, the trilogy is called something else. I think they call it The Wayfarer Redemption, which is 6 books. However, in Australia, this series is called The Axis Trilogy. There's only 3 books, obviously. Then there is a sequel trilogy, and that is called The Wayfarer Redemption. I really dislike it when they rename books in different countries. I don't know why they bother. Anyway, I remember when this was first published. She was a new author. It was her first book, and I loved it. I really did. This world has 3 main species. One is the Ikari, the bird people. Then there is the Allah, the tree people, and then there are humans, who of course have been oppressing the other species when they face a major threat from the north. The plot itself is not original, but I loved the bird people. I thought this was so cool. I loved their society. And Douglas was a history professor. And you can see her books have a lot of detail, which not everyone likes, whereas I do. The Major Religion has shades of Catholicism. The Plough, actually. I just actually loved the name of this religion anyway. And Axis, the main character, is a battle axe, the leader of the axe wielders. I guess you could call it the military arm of this religion. Whilst the trilogy is called Axis Trilogy, and it is predominantly about him, there is also other characters in this book such as Faraday and Azure who also play major roles in this story. In my opinion, Douglas is the best Australian fantasy author that I have read. There may be other authors that I haven't read yet, but out of all the Australian authors I've read, she is my favourite. I own every book that she has ever written, and sadly she passed away very young, in her 50s I think, so there won't be any more. But this is a very well written series. It is one with characters that are flawed and sometimes you hate as well as love. I like that. I like when characters are more well-rounded. I also just really loved this story. I loved this world that she created. I highly recommend the Axis trilogy. I also recommend the sequel trilogy, The Wayfarer Redemption. Sinner is the first book in that series. It involves Axis's children. And that's all I really want to say because I don't want to give away any spoilers from the first trilogy. Number 4, and this one could even be number 3, it fluctuates all the time, is The Magician, or The Rift War Saga by Raymond E. Feist. I think in the States The Magician is split into 2 books. In Australia it is 1 volume, very thick as you can see, and I think this one is the author's preferred edition. Great cover too, isn't it? I remember when this was first published. It came out in 92, which means I probably got it in 93. I loved this book. It was one of the first fantasy series that I read, after Eddings, I think. And to this day, it is still one of my favourites. I love the concept. I've read criticisms that it is very Tolkien-like. I disagree with that entirely. Whilst it might have magical creatures that are similar to traditional fantasy, this one involves 2 different worlds. There is a rift in time and space where an invading force comes through to attack this land, where a young apprentice to magic, Pug, is drawn through to the other world and gains significant powers. It's not telling you anything that you won't read on the blurb. Whilst there is many books that take place in this universe, in these 2 worlds, I think the original series is a trilogy or quadrilogy. I can't recall now. Regardless, this is also one of the best standalone fantasy books. If you weren't interested in reading an entire series, you could just read this and you would love it. The characters are extremely memorable. Marcos the Black, and Pug, and Thomas, and so many others. Arutha, the prince, I loved him as well. And Jimmy the Hand, oh, how can I forget Jimmy the Hand? He is definitely one of my favourite characters in Feist's universe. I think it's been around 15 years since I last read this series, and I've read it several times, 3 or 4 times, but I'm going to be rereading it soon. I highly recommend the Rift War Saga, particularly the first 5 books in that series, though there are many, many others. Number 3 is a newer series for me, one I only read recently. I don't think this is going to surprise anyone, and that is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. Stormfront is the first book. There are 17 books in the series. It is not concluded yet. There are also 2 short story collections, associated with this world. Harry Dresden has become one of my all-time favourite characters in fantasy. I adore him. And I think you won't be surprised at that, since I have reviewed every single book in this series except for the short story collections. This is a series that is urban fantasy, something I wasn't a fan of 20 years ago. But I just loved this world. I love so many of the characters. I love the overall story arc. The earlier books are a little misleading. It seems like first few books are Harry having to deal with a different mythological creature. And as you progress through the series, you realize just how detailed and rich it is in mythology, in creatures, in politics. There are so many aspects to this story that I just love. But most of all, I love Harry. I absolutely adore him. And Karen Murphy. I love this character so much, as well as many, many others. I highly recommend The Dresden Files if you haven't read it. And give the series a go. Don't give up after the first few books. You will notice it will just keep adding and adding to the overall world that Butcher has created. And it's well worth reading. Now, we are up to the last two. There isn't a number 2 because these last 2 books are equal first for me. I honestly cannot decide between them, and they're actually quite different to each other. I don't think the first one will be any surprise to anyone, given how much I have talked about it on my channel, and that is, of course, The Wheel of Time. Yeah, this is definitely an all-time favourite series for me. I cannot express how much I love this series. It is 14 books. I know that isn't for everyone. It is a very long series. But many of the criticisms I've read about it are reasons why I love it. I love the length. I love the descriptive, even flowery prose at times. I love so many of the characters. And I hate some of the characters as well. But it's his world. His world is so rich. I honestly believe it is the best fantasy world I have ever read about, because it is more complex and layered, and there are so many different societies and cultures in this world than I've read in any other series. Not to mention the cast of thousands. I've talked a lot about this series before, so I'm not going to say anything more except that this is a story about a chosen one, the Dragon Reborn, who has to draw together the different warring factions in this world to fight the Dark One. It is epic high fantasy. And if you ask me, it is the best epic high fantasy I have ever read. I adore this series. It has been something that I've loved from the 90s, and having just reread it recently, that hasn't changed. It has definitely stood the test of time for me. I haven't read anything else that matches this. Not since and not before. And now the last fantasy series that is equal first with The Wheel of Time. I know people have been asking me what it is. Well, now you are going to find out. And that is this. The Dark Tower by Stephen King. Very, very, very different to The Wheel of Time, which is why I can never decide between the two. This is more contemporary. It is not high fantasy. It is mystical. Yes, it takes place on this magical other plane, but the characters, this world, I don't know how to describe the Dark Tower series. It is hard to put into words. It is epic, no doubts about it. There are 7 books, including a newer book that takes place somewhere in the middle of the series. It took King many years to finish this. In fact, he wrote this when he was very young. I think he was only 19 or 20. it took him decades to finish the series. And you can definitely see a change in his writing style. But from the moment I started this, I was hooked entirely. I don't often remember the opening lines of a book, but I remember this. And it is one of the best opening lines I have ever read. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. I love that opening line so much. It is so evocative. It gave me this visual immediately about what was going on, and yet these are not predictable books at all. Our main protagonist is Roland, who is definitely morally grey. I love this character so much because he is so complex. He is one of my all-time favourite characters in fantasy or King's books as well. He is conflicted, he is driven, he is ruthless, he is dangerous, he is fanatical, and that's just to name some of his characteristics. And his mission to reach the Dark Tower is, whilst noble in some ways, also very self-destructive. During his travels, he meets up with several other very memorable characters like Jake or Eddie or Susanna. I adore all of these characters, but this is Stephen King's strength, his characters. I always thought so. And I love all of them. The things they have to go through to reach this Dark Tower, the sacrifices, the cost to each of them is something that makes this series stand out from so many others. And the ending for me was perfect. King doesn't always nail the endings of his book, but he nailed this one. I love it. I love it, and part of me does hate it as well, but honestly, I really think nothing could have been better. When I closed the final book, I felt this intense satisfaction that he chose to end it like that. Whereas my brother does not like the ending, and I know a lot of people don't. I know some people wouldn't touch this because it's a Stephen King book, but this isn't a horror series. Even though sometimes horrific things do happen and there is sometimes a real sense of menace, it's not a horror fantasy series. I don't think so. It is about the journey of these four main characters. I honestly can never decide between The Wheel of Time and The Dark Tower because they give me different things and I love them so much equally. If you haven't tried The Dark Tower, I strongly recommend it. I cannot praise this series enough. It really is outstanding, in my opinion anyway. Well, that is my list of 10 favourite fantasy series, though there were a few extras thrown in. But like I said, it is a very fluid list. It will change. It does change all the time. And of course, this is my list. This is the list of fantasy series that I love, which is why I would love to hear what your list of favourite fantasy series are. And you can let me know down in the comments or you can contact me on Instagram. Well, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was one that has been requested several times and I'm glad I finally did it. And if you did like this video, then you can do the usual. You can like, comment and subscribe if you haven't already. I hope you all have a beautiful day and I will see you next time. Bye.